Hi everybody and welcome to this week's first episode of Climate Coffee. We're going to do a couple of them this week, make sure we do a deep dive into all of the issues. My name's Josh Gilbert, I'm the CEO at SUS Global, also the host of Climate Coffee, as you can probably tell by now. We're going to get into the Nobel Prize, we're going to get into some of the really interesting issues around how trade is going to be impacting on changes that we're seeing, as well as actually climate investments and why now is a very good time, a very exciting time, both to be doing the things that we do at SUS, as well as many of the other exciting areas of climate innovation and climate tech. So let's get right into it. So firstly, a Nobel Prize for climate change. Not quite, it's actually the regular Nobel Prize for physics, but it's a very exciting one because it is specifically looking at climate-related impacts. So this is the Nobel Prize for Climate with a trio of scientists, I'm just looking over at my notes, Soichiro Manabe, Klaus Hasselmann and Giorgio Parise, looking at complex climate models and physical systems. And they've effectively been doing this from the 1960s. This isn't work that's happened overnight, this is work that's being recognized today. But I just think that it highlights A, the importance of climate modeling and how it's really starting to get into the mainstream and getting the recognition that it deserves. But B, it's also something that we've been working on for 50 or 60 years in the wider climate modeling community. And although it's maybe coming onto the radars of finance today, of corporates today, in reporting, in risk, in supply chains, it's been happening for a very long time. Interestingly, there was an article doing the rounds and a kind of meme, I guess, on New Zealand around 100 years ago. I can't actually find the notes of it right now, but I'm sure we can dig in and I can post it in the comments below. Basically talking about coal mining in New Zealand and saying about the negative environmental impacts of that in the early 1900s. And then following that, we have things like the Keeling curve. In 1958, this kind of came in, and really it's a foundational kind of breakthrough in terms of the academic work that now many of the environmental and emissions and climate related risk analyses we do today are built upon. So just to highlight, there is this rich history in climate modeling, and yes, I know last week we talked about how some of the AI and machine learning based models are really improving upon the physics based models that we have in the broader kind of community, but also it bodes really, really well for the future. You know, one of the other important articles that we've seen this week is coming from Bloomberg Green, and it basically points to this huge explosion in investment we're seeing across climate tech, across clean tech, across green tech, whatever the different words you want to call it, whether it's in energy, whether it's in transportation with electric vehicles, whether it's in the type of work we're doing at SUS in terms of environmental monitoring, whether it's new financial mechanisms in fintech, all of this space, it's the highest ever number of investments on record this year, which is really exciting. And I think it just kind of shows you that, yes, we're standing on the shoulders of giants in all of these academic communities and all these breakthroughs that come from the 1900s to the 1950s to the 1960s to the Nobel Prize now. We're also seeing this explosion today that will only really be felt in finance, in corporates, across all these different areas in the next 5 to 10 to 15 years. You know, most of the VC kind of timeframes tend to work on kind of 7 to 10 year horizons. So these investments are made from these investment vehicles. Then they wait and these kind of technologies slowly commercialize over a few years, maybe 7 to 10 years they're looking at an exit. Doesn't tend to work as well if you're looking at things like nuclear fusion, which kind of takes decades and decades and decades and millions and billions of dollars of work, but then can transform our energy systems pretty much forever, which is amazing, but these things take time. But my point is, the impact that we're seeing in the investment landscape today will turn into real change and real impact in terms of the world we live in over the next 5, 10, 15 years. So brings us on to another article from the FT, basically talking about the UK's decarbonisation strategy in terms of electricity, saying that by 2035, the UK system is going to be completely decarbonised. It's very aggressive in terms of the timeframes. Boris Johnson's had a little bit of backlash and a little bit of incredulity, I guess is the right word, on how we're going to get there. But again, coming back to that point about the investment and the innovation and the changes we're going to see, I really think we can get there. And I think that if you forecast ourselves, or if you look backwards for ourselves, right? We look back 10, 15 years ago, we look at 2005, 2006, iPhones didn't exist, many of the technologies we have today didn't exist. And if you ask people what the future would look like, I guess a quote from Peter Thiel, right? When he talks about the investment in Twitter, he said, we asked for flying cars and they gave us 136 characters. Now we actually have flying cars with Lilium and many of these kind of eVTOL companies that are commercializing today. Literally these things that people thought would never happen are already happening today. And if you forecast from now to 15 years in the future, there'll be loads of technologies that are commercialized and hitting the electricity grids, all of this money going into clean tech that didn't exist yet, and you have these big oil majors that you have Shell and BP and these types of companies that have done many damaging things to the environment, but are now investing billions of dollars into kind of energy transition focused technologies and startups. Not to say that they're the good guys in any of this, not to say they're the bad guys in any of this, but just to say like change is happening, and it's very, very easy to underestimate the rate of change over the next few years. So that's the second point I wanted to reach on today. The third one I wanted to get into was on trade. So The Economist this week, they talk about things like supply chain shortages and how that's affecting anything from silicon chips in terms of the new iPhones being delayed by a couple of months, to food on our shelves being delayed, to kind of inflationary costs and the impacts that that's having across the economy, both in the US and in the UK. One of the interesting things within that is actually the kind of narrative around protectionism and, in terms of macroeconomics and kind of geopolitics, how maybe a few years ago, maybe if you look back 10, 15 years, there was much more of a collaborative approach to global trade, much more of a kind of rising ocean raises all boats, or rising tide raises all boats, whatever the phrase is. That was a focus and kind of a collaborative approach. And now whether it's kind of the Trump's 19% tax on Chinese goods, which Biden has now said is going to stay, which is an interesting thing, kind of going against narratives that actually the US government over two administrations now has kind of decided upon this protectionist policy to make sure that there is a higher tariff on these goods coming in. And just this shift towards protectionism and global economics is impacting. It impacts on supply chains. Today it's driven by COVID and maybe some of these protectionist policies. In 2011, there were floods driving these types of impacts across supply chains. So in Thailand, there's a load of flooding, which impacted upon many of the industries and many of the supply shortages. And this is only going to continue. One thing I think is really kind of a positive externality maybe in some of these things is some of the regulatory changes. So again, there's another Economist article in this deep dive. They go into how kind of these macro level policies across different countries can actually be positive in terms of driving climate change narratives and climate change agendas, whether that's, in Canada, they're looking at this kind of cross-border marginal tax in terms of a carbon tax. You're getting into difficult things like how do you monitor scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions? Where are the emissions coming from in the supply chain? How would those taxes be imposed when you're looking at cross borders? But I think it's just a really, really exciting kind of new area on the horizon in terms of how we address climate, where it's like, how can these types of slightly more, a bit more friction in the borders between countries, whereas maybe there was this era of globalism which was kind of reducing this friction. Now with this increasing friction, which does have negatives, how can there actually be positives in terms of looking at the climate agenda and making these changes in countries where actually you can create positive frictions in terms of addressing global climate change? So all of these are really, really big issues that we're not just going to unpack in the 10 minutes or so that we're doing on Climate Coffee today, but we are going to drill in over the next few weeks. I'm going to be doing some short clips of these throughout the week. This podcast and this YouTube video and this LinkedIn video are going to be across all of the different networks. So it will be a LinkedIn video, it will be a YouTube video, it will be a podcast. So please make sure you subscribe on the channels. We'll drop the links below. We're going to be doing some short snapshots. We're hopefully going to be on TikTok this week if we can work out like the true millennial that I am, the old man shouting at clouds. I will hopefully work out how to do that. And yeah, really excited at all of this content. I also wanted to do a quick shout out before we go on some of the changes we're seeing globally. I know I saw in the comments last week that often we're talking about North America and we're talking about Europe, which are some of the hubs. I don't know if you've watched any of the TV recently. Well, climate is now on the TV everywhere, but there's the Earthshot Prize in the UK, led by our main man, Sir David Attenborough, all-round national treasure and kind of climate celebrity now, I guess, in his 90th year, and Prince William. have basically done this Earthshot Prize where they're looking at innovative technologies and innovative solutions. They've shortlisted the final 3, and I thought one of the really interesting things was actually governmental initiatives in South America. I believe it's Guatemala. It's Costa Rica. Sorry, I apologize. It's Costa Rica. And they've effectively created new mechanisms kind of at a governmental level to make sure that they are maintaining natural habitats and actually growing those areas. So I think it's an amazing, exciting, kind of interesting approach where kind of comes back to that kind of slightly higher friction, slightly more interventionist in terms of domestic policies rather than global policies, but shows you how actually maybe issues like the tragedy of the commons, the tragedy of the commons is an economic kind of term where it was used for like pastoral lands or grazing lands for cows or sheep or horses, right? And if they're not owned by anybody and everybody's kind of common land can be used, it's not maintained and it gets ruined and then it's not there for everybody. And I think that's a really relevant concept in climate change. Anything from like the mangroves in Indonesia, nobody owns them, nobody protects them, but if they're damaged, everybody stands to lose. Sea level rise, the coastline across the continental United States, that's going to be rising. Nobody's protecting that necessarily explicitly, and it hurts everybody. And this initiative in Costa Rica, in South America, I think is a really, really interesting one that addresses some of these issues. That's all from me on this issue of Climate Coffee. Like I said, please do subscribe, please do comment, please do like, please do tell me what I should be talking about next time. We'll talk to you soon. Cheers. Bye.